The HOA thought they had the power until they cut down the wrong man's oak tree. What happened next left the entire neighborhood in darkness and the HOA in ruins. The fallen jaunt in the heart of a quiet suburban community. The kind of place where manicured lawns were paraded like trophies, and mailboxes gleamed like sentinels of order. There stood a single oak tree that had been there longer than any of the houses. Its sprawling branches stretched across decades of history, shading generations of children who had grown up beneath its leaves. For one man, Daniel, that oak was more than just a tree. It was a memory keeper, a monument to his late father who had planted it as a sapling the year Daniel was born. The oak had grown tall and proud, its roots anchoring deep into the soil of Daniel's property, its trunk wide and sturdy, and its canopy spreading in a perfect umbrella over the back half of his yard. When the wind rustled through its leaves, it carried the whispers of the past, of days spent swinging from its limbs, afternoons reading beneath its shade, and nights watching fireflies dance around its branches. But in the world of homeowners, associations, sentiment and legacy often found themselves at odds with rules and appearances. The Oakwood Heights HOA, a board known for its rigid enforcement of covenants and unyielding obsession with uniformity, had long looked at Daniel's tree with disdain. They claimed it blocked sightlines. They argued it shed too many leaves into neighboring yards. They whispered that its roots might one day compromise sidewalks or utility lines. Yet Daniel had paid no mind. The oak stood firmly within his boundary lines, and his property taxes included it just as much as his house. He believed, foolishly perhaps, that it was untouchable. The first sign of trouble came on an ordinary Saturday morning. Daniel awoke to the sound of engines idling outside. At first, he thought nothing of it. Landscapers were a constant presence in Oakwood Heights, trimming hedges into perfect cubes and mowing lawns with surgical precision. But as the rumble grew louder and the sharp whine of chainsaws pierced the morning air, a sinking dread settled in his stomach. He pulled back the curtain, and his heart stopped. Outside, 3 men in neon safety vests stood at the base of his oak, ropes already tied high into its branches. A cherry picker loomed overhead, and one of the men balanced on the platform, revving a saw that screamed against the stillness of dawn. Daniel rushed outside, disbelief and fury bubbling in his chest, but his protests fell on deaf ears. The men carried paperwork stamped with the HOA's seal, and behind them stood Margaret, the HOA president herself, arms crossed, lips curled into a smug, satisfied smile. In less than an hour, the giant was no more. Limbs that had stretched skyward for decades lay strewn across the yard like corpses. The trunk, sawed into sections, revealed rings upon rings, a silent record of years that could never be reclaimed. By noon, nothing but a raw stump remained, jagged and splintered where life had been stolen. Daniel stood over it, fists trembling, his voice hoarse from shouting, but the decision had already been made. The HOA had declared the tree a nuisance, and in Oakwood Heights, their word was law. The neighbors whispered behind curtains. Some pitied him, others nodded in quiet approval, relieved that the oak's leaves would no longer blow into their yards. Margaret, however, relished her victory openly. She announced at the next board meeting that community safety and aesthetic standards had been upheld. To her, the oak was nothing more than an obstacle, and in cutting it down, she had cemented her control over the neighborhood once again. For Daniel, though, it was personal. The oak had not just been a tree, it had been family, history, and legacy. Its destruction left a wound deeper than the empty space in his yard. The HOA had crossed a line, and Margaret's smugness made it clear they would do it again. To anyone who dared defy them, that night, sitting in the dark of his now unshaded backyard, Daniel made himself a promise. He wouldn't let this pass. He wouldn't be just another homeowner trampled by the HOA's arrogance. They had taken something irreplaceable from him, and in return, he would take from them something they would never forget. As he thought, his eyes drifted toward the rows of utility boxes that lined the back of the neighborhood. Oakwood Heights was powered by a private substation, a small but vital system tucked away behind chain-link fencing near the community clubhouse. Daniel knew this because he worked in renewable energy, and he had studied the layout of the grid when installing his own solar panels years before. Unlike most of his neighbors, He had the knowledge, the tools, and the means to understand exactly how fragile their entire system was. The HOA had cut down his tree without asking, without warning, without care, and Daniel realized, as the night grew darker, that there was a way to make them feel that same helplessness, that same loss of control. It wouldn't be immediate, it wouldn't be impulsive, but it would be precise, devastating, and poetic. If the HOA thought they had power, Daniel would show them what it truly meant to have it taken away. And so, from the stump of the fallen oak, a seed of vengeance began to sprout. The plan takes root in the days that followed the felling of the oak. Daniel's yard became a wound he could not ignore. The stump stood like a gravestone, raw and jagged, the ground around it littered with sawdust that clung stubbornly to the soil no matter how much he raked. Each time he stepped outside, he was reminded of the sound of chainsaws, the smug smile of Margaret, and the indifference of the neighbors who had chosen silence over solidarity. The HOA celebrated its victory in subtle ways. Margaret made sure to mention the removal of hazards in the community newsletter, framing the destruction of the oak as a noble act of service. Others parroted her words, praising the board for keeping standards high and preventing problems before they spread. To Daniel, the hypocrisy was suffocating. For years, he had watched this HOA enforce trivial rules, issuing fines for mailboxes painted in the wrong shade of beige, harassing families who left trash cans out in our past pickup, and obsessing over the length of grass blades. But cutting down his oak had crossed into something darker, a violation of property, of heritage, of personal freedom. At night, as he stared at the void where the tree once stood, his thoughts always circled back to power, not in the metaphorical sense, but literal electricity. The HOA wielded its authority like a current that surged through the community, invisible but inescapable. But Daniel knew something they didn't. Their entire infrastructure depended on a fragile chain of systems, each vulnerable if you knew where to look. And Daniel had spent his career in renewable energy, designing and maintaining grids that powered far larger operations than Oakwood Heights. The community's power supply was an arrangement Daniel had always found curious. Years back, when the HOA had lobbied for their self-sustaining future, they had invested in a small, privately managed substation located at the edge of the neighborhood, near the clubhouse. To most homeowners, it was just a locked-off compound with humming transformers and blinking lights. To Daniel, it was a weak point and exposed artery that, if severed, would bleed the HOA dry. His mind began sketching possibilities. He didn't need to destroy anything. Destruction was messy, traceable, and illegal in ways that would only backfire. No, he needed something more elegant. He needed to cut the current, without leaving fingerprints, to flip the balance of power so completely that Margaret and her board would feel the humiliation of helplessness for days. Daniel walked the neighborhood in the quiet of early mornings and late evenings, when few eyes were watching. He studied the routine of maintenance trucks that visited the substation. He noted the placement of cameras on the clubhouse, the timing of security patrols that drove by once every few hours. He learned where the underground lines fed into the distribution boxes, scattered at the back of properties. Each observation was like a piece of a puzzle falling into place. But even as he planned, doubt gnawed at him. Was it too extreme? Was it worth the risk? He could pursue legal action, but he had spoken to enough neighbors to know how that would end. The HOA had a team of lawyers on retainer, funded by the very fees they extracted from homeowners. Court battles could drag on for years, draining his resources while Margaret spun the narrative in her favor. No legal paths were stacked against him. What he needed was something immediate, undeniable, and unforgettable. The answer came one night as he tinkered in his garage, staring at the inverters and battery backups that powered his solar array. He had designed his home to function independently, to feed excess energy back into the grid when his panels generated more than he consumed. But what if, instead of giving, he took? What if he rerouted, disrupted, or overloaded? The HOA had severed his routes. Perhaps he could sever theirs. The idea evolved from simple fantasy into technical reality. He sketched diagrams late into the night, mapping circuits and identifying weak points. His professional expertise gave him an advantage no outsider could match. He knew exactly how to cause a failure without permanent damage, a blackout that would cripple the neighborhood, but leave his own home untouched, a clean cut. Like pruning a branch, but this time the branch was the lifeline of the HOA's control. Still, he was cautious. Revenge, if sloppy, could expose him. He needed deniability. He began researching ways to mask his actions, to make the outage appear as nothing more than a technical glitch. He combed through online forums where electricians traded stories of phantom surges and unexplained transformer trips. He studied how certain manipulations of voltage could trigger automated shutdowns, without leaving clear evidence of tampering. Each night, the plan grew sharper. He procured tools quietly, ordering equipment, piece by piece to avoid suspicion. A few specialized instruments came from professional suppliers he still had connections with, others from innocuous hardware stores where no one would think twice. He modified his solar control system to act as both a shield and a weapon, ensuring that when the time came, his house would be the only one still glowing in the dark. Meanwhile, Margaret continued to flaunt her authority. She paraded around neighborhood meetings, speaking as if the HOA were a kingdom and she its queen. She boasted about handling problems decisively and mocked the complainers who resisted progress. Daniel noticed how her words stoked resentment among some neighbors. Though most remained too fearful to speak against her, they all believed the HOA was untouchable, that resistance was futile. But soon, they would see what Daniel already knew. No system is untouchable. Every grid has its weakness. Every tyrant has a vulnerability. And when the lights went out, they would understand power could vanish in an instant. Just like his oak had fallen in the span of a single morning. As the first week turned into the second, Daniel felt the plan rooting itself deeper into his resolve. He no longer wrestled with doubt. His anger had matured into clarity. This was no longer about a tree, though the oak had been the spark. It was about control, about showing Margaret and the HOA that their reign was fragile. The night before he intended to act, Daniel stood at the stump of the oak once more. He ran his hand over the rough wood, imagining the rings beneath each one, a memory etched in silence. The HOA had believed they could erase history with a chainsaw. Tomorrow, he would erase their power with the flicker of a current. The tree was gone, but its legacy would live on in the blackout to come. The blackout begins tonight. Daniel had chosen arrived with the kind of stillness that felt like a stage being set. The neighborhood of Oakwood Heights lay quiet under the glow of porch lights and the hum of air conditioners. Lawns were trimmed, hedges sculpted, driveways spotless, all the hallmarks of the HOA's iron grip. To anyone else, it looked like perfection. To Daniel, it looked like a house of cards waiting for a breath of wind. He had prepared meticulously, rehearsing every step in his mind until it felt like muscle memory. In his garage, the equipment hummed softly, his solar inverters already primed. The adjustments he'd made would allow him to isolate his property from the grid while simultaneously triggering a fault in the HOA's substation. He didn't need brute force, just the right signal at the right moment. It was almost poetic, like plucking a single thread that unraveled an entire tapestry. Midnight drew near. The neighborhood was still, blinds drawn, families tucked into bed. Margaret's house, grand and ostentatious at the corner lot, shone brighter than the rest, lit as though she were daring the world to notice her success. Daniel smirked. Soon, those lights would be the first to vanish. He double-checked his system, eyes scanning readouts and voltage levels. Years of experience told him this would work. He'd designed larger systems than this, balanced power loads for entire campuses, and consulted on backup grids for corporations that couldn't afford downtime. By comparison, Oakwood Heights was a toy, model town run by people who knew nothing of the currents beneath their feet. At precisely 12 o'clock, Daniel activated his plan. A series of signals surged from his modified system into the local grid, subtle yet devastating. Within seconds, the first flicker began. Porch lights blinked, televisions snapped off mid-broadcast, and air conditioners stuttered into silence. Then, all at once, darkness swallowed Oakwood Heights. Streetlights went black, leaving the manicured avenues in eerie shadow. The fountains near the clubhouse sputtered to a stop, their once illuminated streams collapsing into still pools. Garage doors froze in mid-motion where late-night rivals had been returning home. Inside the houses, alarms beeped, refrigerators shut down, and stunned families fumbled for flashlights. From his vantage point on his back porch, Daniel watched it all unfold. His own home remained brightly lit, every bulb burning as a beacon in the sea of blackness. His solar ray and battery system kept him immune, a lone island of light in the neighborhood's sudden void. The first voices broke the silence. Shouts carried across yards, questions barked into the dark. Car horns honked as residents tried to use headlights to cut through the pitch black. Dogs barked frantically, unsettled by the sudden absence of the familiar electric hum. Confusion spread like wildfire, and soon panic followed. At Margaret's house, the reaction was immediate. Her lights died just as abruptly as everyone else's, and the grand chandelier that usually glowed through her tall front windows was reduced to nothing but a reflection of moonlight. Daniel imagined her face twisted in disbelief, her certainty of control crumbling in the span of a heartbeat. Neighbors clustered outside, cell phone screens glowing faintly. As they tried calling the HOA hotline, the power company, anyone who might explain the sudden blackout, but the HOA hotline routed straight to Margaret and her board, who were as clueless as anyone, and the power company. They had no jurisdiction. Oakwood Heights' private grid was supposed to be self-reliant, a point of pride for the HOA. The irony was thick. The very system Margaret had bragged about, the one she claimed made the community more independent and efficient, was now the source of its greatest vulnerability. Daniel sat calmly, sipping a drink on his porch, bathed in the warm glow of his still-functioning lights. He could hear whispers from the nearest neighbors, their confusion mixing with envy. Some wondered why his home still had power when theirs did not. Others muttered accusations, suspicion already beginning to point toward the one man who had never bowed to the HOA's rules. Daniel let them talk, let them wonder. The important part was that Margaret and her board had no answers. Hours passed, and still the darkness held. Emergency lights at the clubhouse had flickered on briefly before, sputtering out, drained quickly without the grid to support them. By 2 a.m., the neighborhood had descended into a restless, uneasy quiet. Candles burned in windows. Flashlights moved like fireflies through living rooms, and the once pristine order of Oakwood Heights looked fractured, vulnerable. Margaret, ever the queen of appearances, tried to maintain control. Daniel saw her silhouette pacing on her porch, barking orders at board members who had gathered in her driveway. They carried clipboards and phones, gesturing toward the clubhouse and the substation beyond, but their efforts were futile. Without Daniel's knowledge, they were blind. The blackout wasn't just a loss of power, it was a loss of authority. For Daniel, the satisfaction was overwhelming. The oak tree had been felled in less than an hour, its life stolen without warning. Now, in equal measure, the HOA's sense of control had been stripped from them in a single night. The symmetry was perfect, yet even as he savored their panic, Daniel knew this was only the beginning. One blackout would not be enough to teach them the lesson they needed to learn. The HOA could dismiss it as a technical failure, a fluke, something out of their hands. No, if they were to truly understand, the powerlessness had to linger. The darkness had to stretch on until every smug smile was replaced with desperation. As dawn crept over Oakwood Heights, the houses still sat in silence, powerless and vulnerable. Margaret's carefully curated kingdom looked less like a utopia and more like a hollow shell, stripped of the electricity that made its fountains flow and its lights gleam. And from his porch, Daniel knew the next move would be crucial. He had delivered the first blow. Now it was time to decide just how far he would take this blackout and how deep he would cut the roots of the HOA's power. The HOA loses control morning arrived in Oakwood Heights, not with the usual chirping of sprinklers and hum of air conditioners, but with the eerie silence of a community stripped of its lifeblood. The blackout had persisted through the night, and now, in the clear light of dawn, its full weight settled over the neighborhood. The manicured lawns looked dull without the gleam of sprinklers, fountains stood motionless, and the once uniform glow of porch lights had given way to shadows and uncertainty. Residents emerged from their homes bleary-eyed and anxious. Some clutched mugs of cold coffee brewed hastily with camp stoves. Others tapped their useless phones in frustration, realizing their Wi-Fi had collapsed with the power. Conversations, once polite and carefully worded in this HOA-ruled suburb, turned tense and hurried. For the first time, Oakwood Heights felt less like a model community and more like a village on the edge of crisis. Margaret was furious. Her reputation had been built on control, on projecting an image of flawless order. But now her empire was crumbling in front of her. The HOA board had gathered at her house at sunrise, clipboards and laptops in hand, though the laptops were nothing but dead weight without power. They spoke in hushed tones, but frustration seeped into every word. They had called the utility company, only to be reminded that Oakwood Heights wasn't on the city grid. It was powered by its own private substation, installed years ago as part of Margaret's push for energy independence. Back then, she had boasted about how the HOA was smarter, greener, and better prepared than any other neighborhood. Now, that very independence had become their prison. The utility company could do nothing. The outage was entirely their problem. Margaret ordered teams to inspect the substation near the clubhouse. A small crowd followed, desperate for answers. They found the equipment silent, the control panels dead, and the generators idle. No alarms blared. No sparks flew, just the eerie stillness of a system that had been carefully and deliberately silenced. Suspicion began to spread. Neighbors whispered about how Daniel's house still glowed with light through the night, his appliances running as though nothing had happened. Some speculated he had a backup generator. Others wondered if he had sabotaged the HOA's grid out of spite. Margaret seized on these whispers, her voice sharp as she insisted that Daniel was behind the chaos. She called him a troublemaker, a recluse, someone who had always resisted the HOA's authority. In her mind, it was obvious he had to be responsible, but suspicion alone wouldn't bring back the lights. The longer the blackout stretched on, the more desperate the residents became. Food spoiled in fridges, freezers thawed, and families scrambled to preserve what they could with coolers and ice. Parents worried about their children, unable to keep them entertained without screens or air conditioning. Elderly residents, used to climate-controlled comfort, began to complain of the heat and the danger it posed. By the second night, the neighborhood was unraveling. Battery-powered lanterns glowed dimly in windows. Candles flickered against walls, and the pristine image of Oakwood Heights had been replaced with a patchwork of survival tactics. The fountains that once symbolized prestige now reeked with stagnant water. Trash bins overflowed with spoiled food, and the HOA's carefully enforced standards began to crumble. Margaret tried to maintain authority, calling emergency meetings on her front lawn, where she stood before rows of folding chairs hastily set up under the dim light of lanterns. She spoke of resilience, of community spirit, of working together to overcome the outage, but her words fell flat. Residents no longer looked at her with admiration or fear. They looked at her with suspicion and anger. They wanted answers. They wanted solutions. And Margaret had none. Meanwhile, Daniel watched from the shadows of his porch, his house still, lit brightly as though mocking the darkness around it. His self-sufficient solar and battery system kept him comfortable, with cold drinks in his fridge, fans spinning, and even his security cameras recording the chaos outside. He didn't flaunt his comfort, but the contrast was impossible to hide. Neighbors noticed, and envy festered. Some began to question why the HOA had destroyed his oak tree in the first place, as though cutting it down had been the first domino in a chain of missteps. Margaret grew increasingly desperate. She ordered contractors to be called, electricians, to be rushed in, anyone who might restore the substation. But every attempt ended the same way: confusion. The system wasn't broken in any obvious way, it had simply been switched off from within. Its flows disrupted by something no one could identify. The contractors scratched their heads, muttering that it looked like sabotage, though they couldn't prove it. By the third day, tempers boiled over. Residents began shouting at HOA board members, demanding refunds for their dues, threatening lawsuits, and even questioning Margaret's leadership outright. Families packed up their cars to stay with relatives outside the neighborhood, unwilling to endure another night in the sweltering heat. The image of Oakwood Heights as a perfect, enviable community had collapsed into ridicule. Margaret tried to regain control by escalating her accusations. She rallied the board, insisting that Daniel was the saboteur. Some neighbors nodded in agreement. Fueled by jealousy of his still-powered home, others resisted, pointing out that her own mismanagement had led to the neighborhood's vulnerability. In the first place, lines were being drawn, factions forming, and the once united front of the whole was crumbling. Daniel, for his part, remained calm. He made no public moves, no bold declarations. He simply lived comfortably in his lit-up house, letting the darkness do the talking. He knew Margaret's desperation was pushing her toward a breaking point. The more she lashed out, the weaker her grip became. By the fourth night, Oakwood Heights no longer resembled the polished suburban utopia it once was. Trash piled up, tempers flared, and Margaret's reputation, once untouchable, was in ruins. And as Daniel stood at his window, watching the HOA president pacing furiously in her driveway, he knew the next phase of his plan was about to unfold. The blackout had humbled them, but the real reckoning was still to come. Margaret's desperation turns to Warby the fifth day of the blackout. Oakwood Heights was no longer a picture-perfect suburb. It was a neighborhood on the verge of revolt. The air hung heavy with the stench of spoiled food, and the carefully cultivated image of prestige had crumbled under the weight of desperation. The fountains stood dry, lawns turned brown, and the clubhouse, once the pride of the HOA, was nothing more than a dark shell. Margaret was unraveling. The woman who once strode through the neighborhood like a monarch now paced her driveway with frantic energy, snapping at board members and neighbors alike. Her tailored suits, once pristine, were wrinkled and sweat-stained. Her hair, always styled to perfection, fell limp under the relentless summer heat. Every hour without power chipped away at the illusion of control she had spent years crafting. But Margaret wasn't just losing authority, she was losing allies. Board members whispered behind her back, questioning her leadership. Homeowners confronted her directly, demanding explanations and refunds. Some threatened to sue, others threatened to quit the HOA altogether. Her empire, once so unshakable, was splintering, and in her mind, there was only one person to blame: Daniel. The sight of his home, glowing each night while the rest of the neighborhood sat in darkness, gnawed at her like a wound that wouldn't heal. Neighbors whispered about his lights, about his fans, about his refrigerator still running when theirs had failed. Some accused him of hoarding fuel for a generator. Others speculated he had hacked the system. Margaret didn't care which rumor was true. All she saw was defiance, and all she felt was rage. Her accusations grew louder, her threats sharper. She told anyone who would listen that Daniel had sabotaged the substation, that he was responsible for their suffering. Some believed her, others dismissed her as a desperate woman lashing out. But Margaret didn't just want to accuse, she wanted to punish. On the sixth night, she made her move. With a small group of loyal board members, Margaret marched to Daniel's property under the cover of darkness. Flashlights cut through the night as they stormed up to his gate, their voices sharp and furious. They carried clipboards, cell phones, and hastily written notices declaring that Daniel was in violation of HOA bylaws. They pounded on his gate, demanding entry, insisting that they had authority to inspect his home for illegal equipment. But Daniel had been expecting this. His security system, powered by his independent solar grid, lit up the scene in stark clarity. Cameras recorded every shout, every threat, every attempt to force their way in. Speakers on his porch boomed a pre-recorded message warning them that they were trespassing. The board members hesitated, fear flickering in their eyes. But Margaret pressed forward, her rage overriding caution. She ordered them to cut the lock. She shouted that Daniel had no right to defy the HOA, no right to flaunt his power when the rest of the neighborhood suffered. To her, this wasn't just about electricity, it was about dominance, about restoring the image of authority she believed had been stolen from her. But before they could act, flashing lights cut through the darkness. Police cruisers pulled up, sirens wailing. Someone in the neighborhood had called in the chaos, reporting a mob at Daniel's property. Officers spilled out, their voices commanding and sharp. In the glare of the headlights, Margaret's rage twisted into indignation. She pointed at Daniel's house, accusing him of sabotage, of theft, of endangering the community. But the officers weren't interested in her claims. They were focused on the group of HOA members trespassing on private property, caught on camera. With bolt cutters in hand, the board members stammered, their confidence evaporating under the weight of legal authority. Margaret, however, refused to back down. She screamed at the officers, insisting they arrest Daniel, waving her notices like they were court orders. But the police ignored her fury and warned her instead. Trespassing, vandalism, harassment. The list of potential charges grew longer the more she ranted. In the end, Margaret and her group were escorted back to their homes, humiliated and seething. The incident spread through the neighborhood by morning, whispers turning into full-blown stories. Neighbors who had once feared her now laughed behind her back, mocking the sight of their all-powerful HOA president being scolded like a misbehaving child. Daniel didn't need to lift a finger. The blackout had already stripped the HOA of its veneer of control. Margaret's failed raid had delivered the final blow to her credibility. But Margaret wasn't finished. Humiliation only fueled her obsession. She began plotting in secret. Rallying the few loyalists she had left, she swore she would expose Daniel, destroy him, and restore her crown. What she didn't realize was that the longer the blackout dragged on, the deeper the cracks in Oakwood Heights became. Residents weren't just angry at Daniel, they were angry at her, and soon, her war against one man would ignite a rebellion against the very institution she had built. The final reckoning blackout of Oakwood Heights stretched into its second week. By then, the neighborhood bore no resemblance to the pristine community it once was. Lawns were scorched and yellow, fountains bone dry, and garbage piled along the curbs in sour-smelling heaps. The HOA's carefully curated image of wealth and control had rotted into something raw and unrecognizable. Families who could leave had packed up and gone. Those who remained did so out of stubbornness or necessity, clinging to battery-powered lanterns and portable stoves, their patience wearing thinner with each passing day. The silence of the streets was broken only by the distant hum of generators from nearby neighborhoods, reminders of what Oakwood Heights had lost. And through it all, Daniel's house remained a beacon, brightly lit at night, humming with the quiet comfort of electricity. It stood in stark contrast to the darkened homes surrounding it. To some, it was a symbol of defiance, proof that the HOA's grip could be broken. To others, it was a source of bitter envy, the spark of resentment that Margaret fanned into fury. Margaret had grown desperate. Her once polished appearance had crumbled. She wore the same wrinkled clothes for days, her hair tied back in a hurried knot, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. But worse than her appearance was her loss of influence. The board had fractured. Neighbors openly mocked her, and whispers of dissolving the HOA grew louder with each blackout night. To Margaret, there was only one way to reclaim control: destroy Daniel. She launched her final gambit with a lawsuit, a thick packet of papers filled with accusations of sabotage, trespass, and endangerment was delivered to Daniel's door. Margaret had hired an expensive attorney, draining HOA funds in the process, convinced that legal firepower would succeed where intimidation had failed. She believed that dragging Daniel into court would expose him, humiliate him, and restore her dominance. But Margaret underestimated Daniel. When the day of the hearing came, the courtroom was filled not just with lawyers and officials, but with residents of Oakwood Heights eager to witness the spectacle. Margaret sat tall, her attorney by her side, radiating a brittle confidence. Daniel, calm and steady, carried with him only a folder of evidence carefully prepared and irrefutable. Margaret's attorney thundered about sabotage and damages, painting Daniel as a rogue neighbor bent on destruction. But when it was Daniel's turn, he laid out the truth with precision. He presented footage from his cameras, showing Margaret and her board trespassing on his property with bolt cutters. He unveiled documents proving his home's solar independence, systems completely separate from the HOA's grid. He explained, with the authority of an expert, how the blackout was the result of deliberate modifications to his own setup legal, within the bounds of his property, that had exposed the HOA's fragile infrastructure. Then came the revelation that broke Margaret's case entirely. Proof that the HOA had illegally ordered the destruction of his oak tree, a protected species, under county law. He produced the arborist's report, photographs of the healthy tree before it was cut, and the permit records showing no authorization had ever been granted. The judge's expression hardened. What had begun as Margaret's attack on Daniel flipped into an indictment of the HOA itself. Her lawsuit collapsed under the weight of evidence, and the court ordered the HOA to pay fines, damages, and restitution for the unlawful destruction of Daniel's property. The room erupted in murmurs. Margaret sat frozen, her face drained of color, as her empire collapsed in full view of her neighbors. The same people who once feared her now stared with a mixture of amusement and contempt. Within weeks, the HOA crumbled. Members resigned en masse, unwilling to be tied to Margaret's disgrace. Residents demanded a vote to dissolve the association entirely, citing mismanagement and abuse of power. The motion passed with overwhelming support. The bylaws that had governed every blade of grass, every shade of paint, every tree in the neighborhood were stripped away. Margaret was left a pariah, her reputation in ruins. Lawsuits piled against her personally, and whispers circulated that she might lose her own house in the financial fallout. The woman who once controlled Oakwood Heights with an iron grip now stood alone, her influence shattered beyond repair. Daniel, meanwhile, returned to his quiet life. He replanted a young oak in the corner of his yard, a living symbol of resilience. His house remained bright, powered by his solar independence, standing as a testament to the freedom he had fought for. Neighbors who once avoided him now approached with respect, some even asking for advice on how to install their own systems, eager to break free from the structures that had failed them. The blackout had ended, but the lesson lingered. Power wasn't in the wires running through the streets, it was in the ability to stand firm when others tried to take what was yours. For Margaret, the oak tree had been just a nuisance to cut down, but for Daniel, it had been the line they should never have crossed. And when they did, he didn't just cut back, he cut off their power at the root. The reign of the HOA was over. The oak was gone, but justice had taken its place.